Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to Renaissance Italy, a time of incredible art, flourishing trade, and apparently some very serious concerns about who was wearing what. Imagine strolling through bustling Florentine streets, the air alive with merchant calls and workshop clamor, only to realize your fabulous new hat might just land you in hot water with the fashion police of the 1400s. Picture this. You resplendent in your finest velvet doublet, maybe with a jaunty feather tucked just so, feeling like the bee's knees, the cat's pajamas, the absolute pinnacle of Renaissance chic. The sunlight catches the gleam of a single, perfectly placed pearl button. But then you spot him, the official del Don, the officer of women, though his gaze often lingered on men's finery too, his notebook practically quivering with anticipation. Suddenly, that feather feels less jaunty and more like a declaration of war against the city treasury. Honestly, if you were transported back then with your current wardrobe, you'd probably cause a riot, not for its avant-garde nature, but because your machine-stitched jeans and synthetic t-shirt would be so bafflingly alien they might just assume you were a demon, or worse, someone with terrible taste who somehow got their hands on inexplicably durable, brightly colored rags. Surviving the fashion police would be the least of your worries. Surviving the theologians trying to figure out what synthetic fibers implied about the immortal soul would be the real challenge. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, why not drop your current location and local time in the comments below? It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from as we collectively try to ignore our respective bedtimes. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the rough-hewn flagstones of a Florentine piazza, the late afternoon sun casting long, dramatic shadows that stretch from the Duomo's magnificent dome, a terracotta marvel against the soft blue sky. The air is thick with a symphony of sounds, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rhythmic thud of a weaver's loom from an open window, the murmur of Italian voices discussing everything from the price of wool to the latest sermon by Savonarola, though perhaps not too loudly on that last point. You can almost smell the faint, sweet scent of baking bread from a nearby forno, mingled with the sharper tang of tanned leather and, if the wind shifts just right, the slightly unsettling aroma of the Arno River in summer. Around you, Florence is a stage, and its citizens are most certainly players, each dressed in a costume that speaks volumes before they even utter a word. This isn't just about keeping warm or decent. This is about broadcasting your place in the world, your wealth, your family's honor, your very identity. You see a merchant, his ample frame enveloped in a hoopland of rich, dark wool, its edges perhaps trimmed with fur, even if the day is a little too warm for it. His fingers, adorned with a chunky gold ring or two, clutch a leather pouch that jingles reassuringly with florins. He walks with a certain gravitas, a man of substance, and his clothes are his billboard, proclaiming his success in the competitive world of Renaissance commerce. It's a far cry from simply grabbing a clean shirt. Getting dressed for this fellow was likely a multi-stage project involving at least one assistant and a lot of careful adjustment of sleeves. Then perhaps a group of younger men, sons of noble families, swagger past. Their outfits are more daring, more colorful. Doublets of silk or velvet in jewel tones, sapphire blue, crimson red, emerald green, are slashed to reveal contrasting linings of even finer fabric. Their hose fits snugly, emphasizing a well-turned calf, a point of masculine pride in this era. One might sport a particularly ostentatious codpiece, drawing the eye, while another has a cap adorned with a costly badge or a small glittering jewel. They laugh, their voices carrying, aware of the eyes upon them. This is performance art, a daily parade of status and aspiration. You might think your modern anxiety about whether your shoes quite go with your outfit is stressful, but imagine that, plus the risk of a hefty fine or public shaming if your sleeves are deemed too wide by a city official with a measuring tape and a bad attitude. And the women. If they are of a certain class, they glide by, their presence a testament to their family's wealth. Gowns of heavy brocade, woven with gold or silver thread, shimmer and rustle with every movement. Their sleeves might be enormous, detachable works of art in themselves, perhaps gifted by a wealthy suitor or father. Hair is elaborately dressed, often intertwined with pearls or ribbons, or concealed beneath veils of fine linen or silk. You might catch the glint of a delicate gold chain or the soft glow of pearls at a throat. The sheer amount of fabric involved is staggering. Moving gracefully in such attire was a skill honed from a young age. One mainstream historical fact often highlighted is the incredible boom in the textile industry during the Renaissance. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Genoa became world-renowned centers for the production of luxurious silks, velvets, and brocades, fueling this very visible display of wealth and making these fabrics more available, if still incredibly expensive, than ever before. This availability, of course, only made the game of distinction more intense. But as you watch this vibrant, almost theatrical display of Italian Renaissance attire, you begin to sense an undercurrent. It's not all carefree peacocking. There's a tension in the air, a subtle watchfulness. The way a passerby's gaze lingers a moment too long on a particularly bright silk, the slight frown on an older citizen's face as a flamboyant youth saunters past. This isn't just admiration, it's assessment. It's judgment. Because in this world of carefully constructed appearances, there are rules. Lots of rules. Unseen but ever present, these regulations dictate who can wear what, how much of it, and even where they can wear it. The concept of fashion as we understand it, styles that change, sometimes rapidly, influencing what is considered desirable or a la mode, was really beginning to take firm root during this period, particularly from the 14th century onwards. This was a departure from earlier medieval periods where clothing styles tended to be more static, passed down through generations with slower, less deliberate changes. This new dynamism in dress, this ability for trends to emerge and be adopted or rejected, made clothing an even more potent tool for expressing individuality and status, which naturally made the authorities nervous. If anyone could suddenly look rich or important, what would that do to the carefully ordered social hierarchy? You might see a skilled artisan, a master goldsmith perhaps, his hands clever and his reputation solid. He earns a good living, and he's proud of his success. He wants to show it, perhaps by investing in a fine woolen cloak dyed a deep, respectable blue, or by allowing his wife a few extra yards of silk for her best gown. But he has to be careful. Too much ostentation, and he could be seen as stepping above his station, aping the nobility. That could attract unwelcome attention, not just from the fashion police, but from jealous rivals or those who felt the social order was being threatened. It's a delicate balancing act, looking prosperous enough to maintain your reputation, but not so extravagant as to invite censure. The materials themselves are a source of endless fascination and, for some, anxiety. The silks, imported at great expense from the East or painstakingly produced in Italy's burgeoning silk workshops, shimmer with an almost living light. Velvets, with their deep plush pile, absorb and reflect light in a way that makes colors appear incredibly rich and luxurious. Dyes derived from exotic insects, rare plants, or even crushed gemstones, though the latter is more myth than common practice for fabric, create a dazzling palette. And then there's the glint of metallic threads, real gold and silver, painstakingly woven into intricate patterns, catching the sunlight and announcing, quite literally, a wearer's worth. You can imagine the sheer weight of some of these garments, the rustle and swish as their wearers moved, a constant reminder of the investment they represented. It's one thing to buy a designer bag today. It's another to wear an outfit that might be worth more than a small farm. This incredible vibrancy, this explosion of color and texture and craftsmanship, is precisely what makes Renaissance Italian attire so captivating. It's a visual feast, but it's also the source of the problem we're here to explore. Every shimmering thread, every daring slash in a sleeve, every brightly colored feather, is a potential statement, and some statements, according to the powers that be, were simply not allowed. Historians continue to debate the precise extent to which these regulations were universally enforced or if they primarily targeted the upwardly mobile merchant class, who had the means to dress like nobility but not necessarily the ancient lineage. Were the old noble families given a pass more often, their extravagance seen as their birthright, while the nouveau riche were slapped down for daring to imitate their betters? It's a complex question, and the surviving records often give us the letter of the law, but not always the full picture of its day-to-day application or the subtle acts of defiance and compliance. Think about the sheer effort. You don't just throw on a velvet hoopoland. It's an event. Layers of linen undergarments first, for hygiene and comfort, though comfort is a relative term when you're essentially wearing a small carpet. Then the doublet or kirtle, carefully laced or buttoned. Then the outer gown, heavy and ornate. Perhaps a belt, intricately buckled, from which might hang a dagger or a purse. A hat or a headdress meticulously arranged. It's a commitment. And after all that effort, to step out onto the Piazza della Signoria and realize that the particular shade of crimson you've chosen for your sleeves is this year's forbidden crimson, or that the length of your gown's train is 2 inches over the legal limit for someone of your social standing, well, it's enough to make you want to go back to bed and just wear your plainest, most regulation-approved nightshirt all day. It's the ultimate I have nothing to wear crisis, but with added legal peril. The streets of Florence or Venice or Milan are therefore not just thoroughfares. They are runways, stages, and courtrooms all in one. The desire to be seen, to be admired, to project an image of success and sophistication, is palpable. But so is the invisible web of rules, the unspoken and often very explicitly spoken, or rather written boundaries of taste and propriety. This is the world we're stepping into. A place where beauty and artistry and dress flourish like nowhere else, but where every stitch could be scrutinized, and every color choice could be a political statement. The stakes were high in the Florentine fashion game, and the line between dazzling and dangerously ostentatious was a fine one indeed, often drawn by men with measuring tapes and a keen eye for rule breakers. It's this fascinating intersection of beauty, ambition, and control that we'll be unraveling tonight, as we gently drift through the peculiar world of why, exactly, certain peacock feathers and purple shoes cause such a fuss. So you're standing there in that bustling Florentine piazza, taking in the dazzling, almost theatrical display of fashion, but you're also sensing that undercurrent of scrutiny, that invisible web of rules we touched upon. These weren't just vague societal expectations or your grandmother's disapproving cluck about your ripped jeans. These were actual laws, meticulously drafted, publicly proclaimed, and sometimes fiercely enforced. We're talking about sumptuary laws, a term that sounds rather grand and dusty, like something you'd find in a forgotten corner of a law library, but which had a very real, very personal impact on what you could or couldn't drape over your Renaissance shoulders. The word sumptuary itself comes from the Latin term sumptus, meaning expense or extravagance. So, quite literally, these were laws designed to regulate spending, particularly on luxury and visible consumption. Think of them as the ultimate legally binding dress codes, designed not just for a specific event, but for life itself. Now, why would a society, especially one as vibrant and artistically innovative as Renaissance Italy, get so tangled up in legislating what people wore? It wasn't just a peculiar Italian obsession. In fact, it's a mainstream historical fact that sumptuary laws were surprisingly common across many cultures and time periods. Ancient Rome had them, medieval England and France wrestled with them, even feudal Japan had strict rules about who could wear what kind of silk or carry certain types of swords. It seems that whenever societies develop a bit of disposable income and a taste for the finer things, someone somewhere decides it's time to lay down the law about who gets to enjoy what, at least visibly. But in Renaissance Italy, with its flourishing city-states, its newly wealthy merchant class, and its explosion of artistic and artisanal skill, these laws took on a particular intensity and flavor. The primary goals of these sumptuary laws were generally threefold, though scholars debate whether the primary impetus for these laws was more economic, social, or moral, as all three were often deeply intertwined, like threads in a complex brocade. First and foremost, there was the burning desire to maintain social hierarchy and order. Renaissance society, for all its innovations, was still deeply stratified. You had your established nobility, your wealthy merchants, the popolo grasso or fat people, as they were charmingly known in Florence, referring to their wealth, not necessarily their waistlines, your skilled artisans and shopkeepers, the popolo minuto or little people, and then of course the peasantry and laborers. The idea was that each group had its God-given place, and your clothing was meant to be a clear, unambiguous indicator of that place. If a wealthy banker's wife started dressing in fabrics and styles traditionally reserved for a duchess, it blurred the lines, caused confusion. It might even, heaven forbid, give people ideas above their station. The horror. These laws were a way of saying, know your role and dress accordingly. It was an attempt to keep the visual language of society clear, and prevent what they saw as social climbing via sartorial statement. Imagine the sheer panic if a particularly successful butcher started sporting the same luxurious velvet as a Medici. The social fabric, they feared, might unravel faster than a poorly stitched seam. Secondly, there were significant economic motivations. Renaissance Italy was a hub of international trade, and luxury goods, fine silks from the east, rich furs from the north, exotic dyes were big business. But they were also expensive, and all that lovely cash flowing out to foreign lands to pay for these extravagances made some city fathers a bit nervous. Sumptuary laws could be a tool of protectionism, an attempt to curb the import of foreign luxuries and encourage or coerce citizens to invest in local industries instead. Why buy that ridiculously overpriced Byzantine silk? The argument might go. When you can get perfectly good Florentine wool? Sometimes the laws aim to prevent capital flight, keeping wealth within the city-state. Other times they might inadvertently or intentionally protect the market for certain local luxury goods by restricting even more outrageous foreign ones. It was a complex economic game, and your wardrobe was one of the playing pieces. One can almost imagine a Buy Florentine or Else campaign, promoted with all the subtlety of a public shaming for wearing the wrong kind of lace. And thirdly, but by no means least importantly, there were powerful moral and religious concerns. The church, a hugely influential force in Renaissance life, often preached against vanity, excess, and worldly ostentation. Lavish spending on clothing was seen not just as wasteful but as a sign of pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. Friars like the fiery Girolamo Savonarola in Florence famously railed against the luxury and moral decay he saw around him, even instigating the bonfire of the vanities, where citizens were pressured to burn their mirrors, cosmetics, fine clothes, and other symbols of worldly pleasure. Sumptuary laws often reflected these moral anxieties, aiming to promote modesty, thrift, and a focus on spiritual rather than material matters. The idea was that if people spent less time and money on adorning their bodies, they might spend more time adorning their souls, or at least contributing to the church-building fund. An overly flamboyant hat wasn't just a fashion faux pas. It was a potential gateway to moral ruin, a slippery slope paved with silk and leading directly to perdition. Or so the sermons often implied. So what did these laws actually look like? Well, they could be incredibly broad, forbidding entire categories of people from wearing certain colors or materials. For instance, a law might state that only nobility could wear ermine fur, or that only the immediate family of a reigning duke could wear cloth of gold. But they could also be astonishingly, almost comically specific. This is where you find some of the quirky, lesser-known tidbits of sumptuary legislation. There were rules about the maximum length of a train on a woman's gown, sometimes measured to the inch. There were restrictions on the number of pearl buttons you could have on a single garment, or the width of a velvet trim. Some laws specified the value of the jewelry a woman could wear in public, or even the type of embroidery permitted on her sleeves. You might find a statute meticulously detailing which social ranks were allowed to wear silk linings, and which had to make do with linen. It's like an incredibly detailed instruction manual for how not to get fined for your outfit. One can only imagine the town crier, his voice echoing in the stone-flagged square, proclaiming, "Hear ye, hear ye! By order of the magnificent council, no citizen below the rank of knight shall henceforth wear more than 3 non-functional buttons on any visible sleeve, nor shall any shoe possess a point exceeding 1/5 the length of the wearer's actual foot, upon penalty of a fine of 10 soldi and considerable social awkwardness." You can picture the scene. A new edict posted, the parchment still smelling faintly of official ink and beeswax seals. A small crowd gathers, some craning their necks to read the densely packed Latin or vernacular Italian, others listening as someone more literate reads it aloud. There'd be murmurs, frowns, perhaps a few eye rolls from the younger, more fashion-forward members of the crowd. Only 2 strands of pearls now? What is this, a convent? One might whisper to another. The sheer mental energy required to keep track of these ever-changing regulations must have been exhausting. It's like trying to understand the offside rule in football, but if you get it wrong, you owe the government money. And these rules weren't static. They were constantly being revised, updated, reissued, often in response to new fashion trends or perceived societal failings. What was perfectly acceptable one year might be on the ban list the next. This constant flux meant that everyone, from the wealthiest noble to the aspiring artisan, had to stay informed, lest they inadvertently commit a fashion crime. It added another layer of anxiety to the already complex business of social navigation. You wouldn't just worry if your outfit was flattering. You'd worry if it was legal. The aim was often to create a very visible, very legible social landscape. When you looked at someone, their clothes were supposed to tell you instantly who they were, what they did, and where they stood in the pecking order. If a merchant's wife was indistinguishable from a countess, or a stonemason's son dressed like a young lord, it threatened this legibility. It created a kind of social static, a blurring of the lines that made the established elites deeply uncomfortable. They wanted society to be a well-organized book, where everyone stayed on their assigned page, and sumptuary laws were the editorial guidelines ensuring no one tried to rewrite their chapter with too much gold thread. Of course, the existence of these laws also tells you something else. People were constantly pushing the boundaries. If no one wanted to wear expensive silks or fancy furs or bright colors, you wouldn't need laws to stop them. The very fact that these prohibitions were so detailed and so frequently repeated suggests that there was a continuous tug-of-war between the desire for personal expression and luxurious display, and the authorities' attempts to control it. It was a game of cat and mouse, played out in the tailors' shops and on the city streets, with velvet and silk as the contested territory. And as we'll see, the mice in this scenario were often quite ingenious in finding ways to nibble at the edges of the rules, if not outright flout them. The human desire to look good, or at least to look how you want to look, is a powerful force, even in the face of fines and public condemnation. And so these dress codes, these sumptuary laws, became a fascinating battleground for identity, economy, and morality in the heart of the Renaissance. So we've established that Renaissance Italy was a place where your wardrobe was under constant, often legal scrutiny, governed by those meticulous and sometimes maddening sumptuary laws. These weren't just vague guidelines. They were attempts to paint a clear picture of society through fabric and finery, driven by concerns about social order, economic stability, and public morality. Now, having understood the general why behind these curious laws, let's zoom in on one of their particularly dazzling and, as it turns out, problematic targets, the peacock feather. Yes, that shimmering iridescent marvel of nature, a miniature rainbow captured in a plume, found itself frequently on the wrong side of the law. Picture a single peacock feather. You're holding it, perhaps, turning it gently in the soft candlelight of your quiet room. Notice the way the colors shift and play: greens, blues, golds, a hint of bronze and violet. And then there's the eye, that iconic ocellus, looking back at you with an almost hypnotic intensity. It's undeniably beautiful, a piece of natural artistry that few human creations could rival. And that, in essence, was the beginning of the peacock problem. Its sheer, unadulterated beauty was both its appeal and its downfall in an age obsessed with regulating appearances. Peacocks and their magnificent plumage weren't a new discovery in the Renaissance. It's a well-documented historical fact that these birds, originally native to India and Southeast Asia, were known and prized in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Greeks and Romans admired them, kept them in gardens, and used their feathers for decoration. Alexander the Great was said to have been so astonished by their beauty that he forbade his soldiers from harming them. So by the time we get to Renaissance Italy, the peacock feather already carried a long history of being associated with luxury, exoticism, and a certain kind of divine or regal splendor. In some early Christian iconography, the peacock was even a symbol of immortality and resurrection, as its flesh was believed not to decay, and the all-seeing eyes on its feathers were sometimes linked to the omniscience of God, drawing from the myth of Argus Panoptes, the hundred-eyed giant whose eyes were said to have been transferred to the peacock's tail by the goddess Hera. So far, so good, right? Beautiful, symbolic, even a touch divine. What's not to like? Well, as with many things in Renaissance society, context and interpretation were everything. While the peacock could symbolize immortality, it far more often, and more loudly, screamed vanity. That same spectacular beauty that captivated Alexander and inspired artists also made it a prime candidate for condemnation by moralists who saw it as a potent symbol of superbia, or pride, the deadliest of the seven sins. The way a peacock struts, displaying its magnificent train, became an easy metaphor for human arrogance and excessive self-regard. Proud as a peacock wasn't just a saying, it was a moral judgment. Now imagine you're a fashionable Florentine or Venetian in, say, the late 15th century. How might you incorporate these alluring feathers into your ensemble? Perhaps a single artfully placed plume on a velvet cap, catching the light as you incline your head. Or maybe a fan, constructed entirely of peacock feathers, waving languidly in a noblewoman's hand, its iridescent eyes seeming to observe the room. Some portraits from the era show gowns or sleeves with peacock feather motifs embroidered onto them, a more subtle but still unmistakable nod to this luxurious item. At extravagant banquets, roasted peacocks were sometimes redressed in their feathers and presented as a showpiece, though that's more about culinary ostentation than daily wear. The point is, these feathers were undeniably showy. They were nature's bling, and Renaissance Italians, never ones to shy away from a bit of sparkle, knew just how to use them to make a statement. That hat wouldn't just keep the sun off, it would be a miniature broadcast tower for your status, or at least your aspirations. This is where the sumptuary lawmakers started to twitch their official noses. If everyone started sporting peacock feathers, what would it mean? Firstly, there was the issue of sheer ostentation. Unlike a subtly expensive dark wool, a peacock feather is an in-your-face declaration of, well, something. It's hard to be modest while wearing a large, shimmering feather that looks like it was plucked from a mythical creature. It was seen as an unnecessary adornment, serving no practical purpose other than to draw attention to the wearer. And in a society trying to curb excessive displays, the peacock feather was like a flamboyant guest who talks too loudly at a very solemn dinner party. Then there was the cost and potential rarity. While peacocks were kept in Italy, they weren't exactly roaming every farmyard. Maintaining an estate lush enough to support peacocks, or purchasing the feathers themselves if they were imported or traded over distances, could be expensive. This automatically made them a status symbol. If only the wealthy could afford them, then their use by the upwardly mobile merchant class could be seen as an attempt to visually usurp the privileges of the nobility, blurring those all-important social distinctions we talked about earlier. It's one thing for a duke to have a peacock feather. It's quite another for the local spice merchant's son to show up looking like he's auditioning to be the duke's avian mascot. Moreover, the potent symbolism of pride associated with the peacock was a major red flag for the church and moral authorities. In an era where sermons frequently warned against the dangers of vanity and worldly attachments, decking oneself out in peacock feathers was like waving a banner that said, "Look at me. Am I not fabulous and utterly unconcerned with humility?" It's debated among art historians and social historians alike whether the primary objection to peacock feathers was their cost, their foreignness, real or perceived, as they weren't native everywhere, or their potent symbolism of pride. Likely, it was a potent cocktail of all three that made them such a tempting target for restriction. Adding another layer to this is a quirky, lesser-known interpretation of the peacock's 100 eyes. While sometimes seen positively, as representing God's omniscience or the vigilance of Argus, some moralists flipped this on its head. They argued that these eyes represented an all-seeing vanity, a narcissistic obsession with being looked at, or even in some interpretations, that they could be associated with the evil eye, if not used in a pious context or if they encouraged worldly pride. So the very feature that made the feather so mesmerizing could also be imbued with negative connotations, making it all the more suspect in the eyes of those who drafted the sumptuary laws. Imagine a city official squinting at your hat. That's an excessive number of eyes, citizen. Are you trying to outstare God himself? Or perhaps just trying to make everyone else feel inadequately ophthalmic? Either way, it's a fine. So the laws would start to appear. No woman below the rank of a contessa shall wear more than 2 peacock feathers in her hair or upon her person. Or, the use of peacock feathers in fans is restricted to ceremonial occasions attended by the Doge. These are illustrative examples, as the specifics varied wildly. The aim was to limit their use, to reserve them for the truly elite, or to strip them of their everyday flaunt-worthiness. It wasn't necessarily about eradicating them entirely, but about controlling who could deploy their dazzling power and when. You can almost picture a special peacock plume purity patrol, a subdivision of the fashion police, whose sole job was to ensure that feather regulations were strictly adhered to. Probably not, but the image of stern-faced officials meticulously counting feathers on a lady's hat is certainly an amusing one. The irony, of course, is that the Renaissance was an era that celebrated beauty, artistry, and the natural world. Artists meticulously studied and rendered the details of flora and fauna. Yet, here was this stunning natural object, the peacock feather, being treated as a problematic commodity, a beautiful troublemaker. It highlights the inherent tension in Renaissance society, a deep appreciation for aesthetic splendor running headfirst into an equally deep anxiety about social order and moral rectitude. The peacock feather, in its shimmering, complicated glory, sat right at the heart of that conflict. It was too beautiful, too symbolic, too much for a world that wanted its visual hierarchies to be clear, and its moral compass to point firmly away from excessive self-adornment. And so, if you were that Renaissance individual contemplating whether to add that lovely feather to your ensemble, you'd have to weigh your desire for that dazzling flash of iridescent color against the potential for a fine, a public rebuke, or at least a sermon dedicated to your vanity. It was enough to make you think twice, perhaps opting for a slightly less ostentatious, but still legally compliant ostrich plume. The peacock feather, a tiny masterpiece of nature, became a tiny battleground in the ongoing war for social and moral order, its vibrant colors a little too loud for the quiet conformity desired by the rulemakers. From the shimmering iridescent plumage of the peacock, a natural marvel that nonetheless caused so much consternation for Renaissance rulemakers, let's turn our gaze from a specific adornment to a singular hue, a color that carried even more weight, more history, and certainly a more staggering price tag: purple. Not just any purple, mind you, but that deep, resonant, almost mythical shade known as Tyrian purple, a color so exclusive, so steeped in tradition, that to wear it was to make a statement that resonated through centuries of power and prestige. If peacock feathers were a loud boast, Tyrian purple was a thundering proclamation. Imagine, if you will, a bolt of fabric dyed with this legendary color. In the dim light of a merchant's exclusive back room, or perhaps illuminated by the flickering candles of a palazzo, it wouldn't just be purple, it would be an experience. Depending on the precise dyeing process and the type of murex snail used, the color could range from a deep crimson, almost a blood red, to a rich violet, and even a dark blue purple. It was said to be incredibly color-fast, resistant to fading from sunlight or washing, a quality that only added to its value. You can almost feel the weight of such a fabric, not just its physical heaviness, but the immense weight of its symbolism and cost. This wasn't the gentle lavender of a spring flower. This was a purple that spoke of emperors and ancient dynasties. The prestige of Tyrian purple stretches far back into antiquity, long before the Medicis or the Borgias were even a whisper on the winds of time. The Phoenicians, those master traders of the ancient Mediterranean, were the original producers, with their dyeing centers in Tyre and Sidon, hence the name Tyrian. They perfected the art of extracting this dye from several species of sea snails, most notably the Murex brandaris and Murex trunculus. The Romans inherited and amplified this association of purple with supreme power. Roman emperors clad themselves in Tyrian purple togas, a tradition that became so entrenched that the color became synonymous with imperial authority. The phrase "to be born to the purple," natus in purpura, literally meant to be born into a reigning imperial family, often in a special room draped with porphyry, a purple stone. Roman senators of high rank were permitted to wear a stripe of Tyrian purple on their togas, a clavis purpureus, its width indicating their status. So by the time the Renaissance dawned, this color wasn't just pretty. It was soaked in the legacy of empire, a visual shorthand for ultimate authority and almost divine right. Now, why was this particular purple so incredibly, prohibitively expensive? The answer lies with those unassuming sea snails. Each tiny snail, painstakingly harvested from the Mediterranean seabed, contains only a minuscule amount of the precursor fluid in its hypobranchial gland. To produce even a small amount of dye, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of these snails had to be collected, their shells cracked open and the glands extracted. It's a mainstream historical fact that true Tyrian purple dye was often worth more than its weight in gold. Imagine the sheer labor involved. Fleets of small boats, divers braving the waters, and then the meticulous, time-consuming process of extraction. It makes the efforts of even the most dedicated modern artisan seem like a walk in the park. You could probably build a small cathedral for the price of dyeing a few full imperial robes. And here's a quirky and rather pungent tidbit about its production. The process of transforming the glandular secretions into the vibrant dye was notoriously smelly. The extracted glands were typically left to decompose in salt water under the sun for a specific period, a crucial step in the chemical reactions that produce the color. Ancient writers commented on the foul stench that hung around Tyrian purple dye works, so potent that these facilities were usually located well outside city centers. So if you were someone incredibly wealthy parading around in your Tyrian purple finery, you might have been quite literally smelling rich. though perhaps not in a way that would appeal to modern sensibilities. One shudders to think what eau de murex extreme might have fetched on the Renaissance perfume black market. Probably not much. Given this ancient prestige and astronomical cost, it's no surprise that Tyrian purple became a prime target for sumptuary laws in Renaissance Italy. If the goal was to maintain social hierarchy, then nothing said, "I am at the very, very top of the food chain," quite like being swathed in a color that cost a king's ransom and was historically reserved for emperors. For anyone else, a wealthy merchant, a successful banker, even minor nobility, to wear substantial amounts of true Tyrian purple would have been seen as an act of profound arrogance, perhaps even bordering on treason or blasphemy. It was an attempt to visually appropriate the ultimate symbols of power. Who do you think you are? The law might as well have asked, Caesar reincarnated with a better tailor? So decrees would be issued, strictly limiting the use of this imperial hue. It might be reserved exclusively for the ruling sovereign and their immediate family, or perhaps for specific, highly symbolic religious vestments, though often the purple of cardinals was actually a brilliant scarlet, a distinction that could sometimes be blurred in common parlance but was quite specific in terms of dye source and cost. The idea was to protect its unparalleled status. If everyone who could scrounge up enough florins started wearing Tyrian purple shoes, or a purple hat, its unique power as a symbol would be diluted. And the ruling class, much like a modern luxury brand, was very keen on protecting its exclusivity. Now you might be wondering, were there no other purples? Of course there were. Renaissance dyers were skilled chemists, masters of extracting color from all sorts of natural sources. They could produce various shades of violet, lilac, and reddish purple using more accessible materials like certain lichens, which produced orchil or cudbear, or the roots of the madder plant, which, with different mordants, could yield a range of colors including purplish tones. There was also folium, from the plant Chrysophora tinctoria, which gave a violet hue. These dyes were far less expensive than Tyrian purple, and therefore more within reach for a wider segment of the population, though still often considered luxury colors compared to basic browns and undyed fabrics. This is where things could get a bit tricky for the enforcers of sumptuary laws. There's ongoing discussion among historians about how consistently Renaissance sumptuary laws could distinguish between true, astronomically expensive Tyrian purple derived from murex snails, and these other, more accessible violet and purple hues. Could a clever dyer create a color that looked remarkably like Tyrian purple, but cost only a fraction of the price? Almost certainly. Could a wealthy individual try to pass off a less expensive purple as the real deal, or argue that their particular shade of violet was licit lichen purple, and not verboten mollusk mauve? The potential for confusion, and for deliberate deception, was significant. You can imagine a well-dressed lady, halted by an official. "Signora, that magnificent gown appears to be of the prescribed imperial purple." And she, with a perfectly innocent flutter of her eyelashes, replies, "Oh, this old thing? Heavens no, officer. It's merely grape aspiration. A new shade my dyer assures me is made entirely from fermented elderberries and the tears of disappointed sumptuary officials." The laws, therefore, might attempt to be very specific, perhaps referring to purpura blata, a bluish purple, or purpura tyria, the reddish purple, to denote the genuine snail-derived article. Or they might focus on the value of the garment, assuming that anything truly Tyrian purple would automatically exceed the permitted expenditure for most people. Even if it wasn't the genuine multi-thousand snail article, any rich, deep purple was still a statement. It still evoked that aura of luxury and importance, and thus even the imitation or less costly versions often found themselves under restriction, especially for the lower echelons of society. Those purple shoes mentioned in our video title, if dyed with genuine Tyrian purple, would have been an ostentatious display for almost anyone outside the absolute ruling elite. Even if they were a less expensive violet, they might still raise eyebrows and the attention of a passing official if worn by someone deemed below the salt for such finery. The desire for purple, that color of kings and emperors, was a potent one. It was a visual taste of ultimate power, a connection to a glorious past. But its very potency made it dangerous in a society so keen on everyone knowing and keeping their place. To wear it was to play with fire, or rather, with the chromatic equivalent of the imperial scepter. The sumptuary laws aimed to ensure that only those with the genuine right to such symbolic fire could wield it, lest the whole social order go up in a blaze of violet-hued vanity. It was a constant reminder that in Renaissance Italy, even a color could be a political statement, and the price of purple was far more than just florins and soldi. It was a careful calculation of status, ambition, and the ever-watchful eyes of the law. So we've journeyed through the iridescent allure of the peacock feather, and felt the weighty prestige of Tyrian purple, two items so potent in their symbolism and cost that they practically begged for regulation in the meticulously ordered world of Renaissance Italy. We understand that rules existed, often with dizzying specificity, but this naturally leads to the question, who exactly were the they behind these pronouncements? Who were these arbiters of elegance, these legislators of lavishness, that dedicated so much parchment, ink, and stern deliberation to the cut of your doublet or the color of your shoes? It wasn't a single shadowy figure, but rather a confluence of authorities, each with their own reasons for wanting to write your wardrobe rules. First and foremost, you have the city councils and communal governments. Imagine yourself a fly on the wall. A very discreet, appropriately dressed fly, of course, in the Palazzo della Signoria in Florence, or a similar seat of power in Venice or Milan. The room is likely grand, perhaps adorned with frescoes depicting allegories of good government or scenes of civic triumph. Around a heavy wooden table sit serious-faced men, the city's leading citizens. Wealthy merchants, respected bankers, established nobles, and learned jurists. They are discussing matters of state, trade agreements, diplomatic missions, public works, and yes, the pressing issue of what people are wearing. You might hear the rustle of official documents, the scratch of a quill as a clerk takes notes, the low murmur of debate in formal Italian. For these civic leaders, sumptuary laws were a vital tool for several reasons. Chief among them, as we've touched upon, was the maintenance of social order. They genuinely believed that a well-ordered society, where everyone knew their place and dressed accordingly, was a stable and prosperous society. Too much sartorial ambition from the lower or middle classes could be seen as a challenge to the established hierarchy, a visual form of rebellion that might lead to actual unrest. They also worried about economic stability. If citizens, particularly the burgeoning merchant class, spent excessively on imported foreign luxuries, it could lead to a drain of precious capital from the city-state. Or individuals might bankrupt themselves trying to keep up with the latest flamboyant fashions, leading to personal ruin and wider economic disruption. There was also a strong element of civic pride and reputation. These city-states were fiercely competitive, not just economically and militarily, but also in terms of their image. A city known for its modest, industrious, and well-behaved citizens was considered more virtuous and therefore, stronger than one perceived as decadent, frivolous, and awash in chaotic displays of private wealth. The council members wanted Florence or Venice or Siena to be seen as a model of good governance and moral rectitude, not a den of peacock-feathered profligacy. It's a bit like a modern town council worrying that too many garish lawn ornaments might bring down property values for everyone, but on a much grander society-wide scale. One can almost picture an exasperated councilman sighing, "Another decree on sleeve widths? We just did this last spring. Can't people just be less pointy for a season?" This touches upon a mainstream historical fact. Sumptuary laws were often reissued, amended, and updated with almost bewildering frequency, a clear indication of both their perceived importance to the authorities and the persistent difficulty of actually getting people to comply with them. It was an ongoing legislative battle against the ever-shifting tides of fashion. Next, consider the guilds. Their role in the creation and enforcement of sumptuary laws is a bit more complex, sometimes a source of the rules, sometimes a target. The powerful guilds representing wool manufacturers, silk weavers, goldsmiths, furriers, and other artisans were integral to the economic life of any Renaissance city. In some instances, these guilds might actively lobby for or support certain sumptuary regulations, especially if those laws could be framed to benefit local industries. For example, a powerful wool guild might subtly encourage restrictions on the excessive use of imported silks for everyday wear among the general populace, thereby shoring up the market for their own high-quality woolen cloth. Our Florentine wool, they might argue, is both virtuous and durable, unlike that flimsy, morally dubious silk from who knows where. They were also intensely concerned with maintaining standards of quality and craftsmanship. This could indirectly feed into sumptuary ideals by promoting an aesthetic of well-made, durable goods over fleeting, ostentatious novelties. A guild master, his hands stained with dye or callus from the loom, might have a very particular idea of what constituted good taste versus vulgar display, and this could align with the aims of the sumptuary legislators. You can imagine a guild meeting where the elders debate the precise number of gold threads per inch that constitutes appropriately luxurious versus scandalously excessive for a non-noble's purse. However, guild members themselves, especially successful master artisans who were accumulating wealth, could also be the targets of sumptuary laws if their personal dress became too flamboyant and started to emulate that of the nobility or the wealthiest patricians. So the guilds walked a fine line, sometimes acting as enforcers of standards, sometimes as advocates for their trade, and sometimes finding their own members chafing under the very restrictions they might otherwise publicly support for others. And then of course there was the church. Its influence on the moral climate, and by extension on sumptuary legislation, cannot be overstated. Popes, bishops, and especially charismatic, reform-minded preachers like Girolamo Savonarola in Florence wielded immense power through the pulpit. Picture yourself in a crowded cathedral, the air thick with incense and anticipation. The preacher ascends the pulpit, his voice echoing through the stone arches, and he begins to rail against the sins of vanity, luxury, and worldly attachment. He paints vivid pictures of the moral decay caused by excessive spending on clothes, jewels, and frivolous adornments. He reminds the congregation that true beauty lies in spiritual devotion, not in silk robes or peacock feathers. Such sermons, delivered with passion and conviction, could create a powerful wave of public opinion, making it easier for secular authorities to pass and enforce sumptuary laws. The Church provided the divine justification, framing these regulations not just as matters of social order or economic prudence, but as essential for the salvation of souls. Your immortal soul is at stake, the sermon might thunder. And you're worried about whether your hat has enough plumes? Cast off those worldly vanities, lest they drag you down to the fires of perdition, which, by the way, are far hotter than any summer day in Florence, no matter how many fans you own. Sometimes a quirky tidbit of history shows specific individuals becoming the driving force behind a new wave of sumptuary crackdowns. A particularly zealous magistrate, inspired by a fiery sermon or his own moral convictions, might initiate a renewed campaign of enforcement, leading to a flurry of fines and public admonishments. Or a renowned preacher, through the sheer force of his personality and rhetoric, could temporarily shame an entire city into adopting more modest attire. These moments often didn't last, as fashion's allure is persistent, but they highlight the powerful role that individual conviction, amplified by institutional authority, could play. These three main bodies, the civic government, the guilds, and the church, didn't always operate in perfect harmony, but their interests often overlapped when it came to sumptuary laws. The city council wanted an orderly populace, the church wanted a moral one, and the guilds wanted a stable economic environment, preferably one that favored them. A law restricting excessive foreign imports could please the moralists, less vanity, the local guilds, less competition, and the city treasury, less capital flight. However, there could also be tensions. Wealthy merchants sitting on the city council might, in their official capacity, vote for laws restricting luxury, while in their private capacity, they were the very ones importing and selling those luxuries, or wanting to wear them to display their own success. It's a classic case of do as I say, not as I do, or perhaps, do as I say when I'm wearing my official council robes, but my party doublet is another matter entirely. Historians debate the degree to which sumptuary laws were a purely top-down imposition by elites seeking to protect their own status, versus a reflection of broader societal anxieties about rapid social and economic change, anxieties that might have been shared even by some of those who found themselves restricted. Were ordinary people entirely resentful of these laws, or did some also feel a certain comfort in a visually ordered world, or even a sense of moral righteousness in adhering to modest dress, looking askance at those who flouted the rules? The answer is likely complex and varied. But what is clear is that the impulse to regulate appearance, to dictate who could wear what, came from the very centers of power and moral authority in Renaissance Italy. These were not casual suggestions. They were the considered pronouncements of the men who ran the cities, shaped the economies, and guided the spiritual lives of the populace. And their collective attention, for better or worse, was very much on your wardrobe. We've met the rulemakers, the city councils debating in their grand halls, their brows furrowed over the appropriate length of a gentleman's tunic, the guild masters meticulously defining the boundaries of acceptable craftsmanship versus ostentatious frippery, and the preachers thundering from their pulpits, painting vivid pictures of the spiritual perils lurking in an overly embellished sleeve. Decrees on parchment, no matter how elegantly calligraphed or sternly worded, are one thing. Ensuring that citizens actually obeyed these elaborate elegance edicts out on the bustling streets and even within the relative privacy of their homes was quite another. So, how did Renaissance authorities try to police your petticoats and pass judgment on your plumes? What happened when your personal style clashed with the city's statutes? Firstly, many cities appointed special officials tasked specifically with upholding these sumptuary laws. In Florence, for instance, you had the rather intriguingly named Ufficiali del Donne officers of women. Despite their title, their remit often extended to scrutinizing men's attire as well, because vanity, it seems, was considered an equal opportunity failing. You can imagine these individuals, perhaps not the most popular figures in town, patrolling the piazzas and marketplaces, their eyes peeled for illicit lace, forbidden furs, or an offensively oversized codpiece. They might carry a copy of the latest regulations, or even one might humorously imagine, a small, officially sanctioned measuring tape for checking the precise width of a ribbon or the audacious length of a shoe point. "Excuse me, signora." You can almost hear a particularly officious enforcer in tone, his voice devoid of any discernible warmth, but the city ordinance clearly states that sleeves of such damask are permissible only for individuals whose declared annual income exceeds 500 florins. "May I see your tax receipts, or shall we proceed directly to the confiscation of said sleeves?" Their duties involved more than just eagle-eyed observation. They had the authority to stop individuals, question them about their clothing, and in some cases, issue on-the-spot fines or summonses to appear before a magistrate. And here's a quirky tidbit that surely added a certain enthusiasm to their work. In some regions, these sumptuary officials were entitled to keep a percentage of the fines they collected. This practice, while perhaps intended to ensure diligent enforcement, could also, as you might imagine, lead to a certain overzealousness. Suddenly, that slightly too bright yellow you're wearing doesn't just offend public. A very visible and historically mainstream example of this kind of controlled revelation was the fashion of slashing and painting. This involved making cuts or slits in the outer layer of a garment, a sleeve, a doublet, even shoes, to reveal a contrasting, often richer and more expensive fabric underneath. So your outer sleeve might be a perfectly legal dark velvet, but through carefully art-directed slashes, glimpses of shimmering gold brocade or vibrant crimson silk would peek through. It was a way to display wealth and taste somewhat indirectly, a sartorial striptease that hinted at greater splendors within. Scholarly interpretations differ on whether the primary motivation for slashing was purely aesthetic. It did create interesting textural and color contrasts, or if it also served as a clever workaround for sumptuary laws in some instances, allowing for the display of restricted fabrics in a manner that wasn't an outright full garment violation. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a fashionable way to hint at the luxury you could afford, even if you weren't supposed to flaunt it too openly. Then there was the ingenuity of temporary transformations and convertible clothing. Imagine a noblewoman with a beautiful gown that was perfectly legal, except for its extravagantly long train, which was strictly reserved for ladies of a higher rank. Her solution? The train might be detachable, fastened with discreet hooks or ties. When out and about in less scrutinized areas, or at a private gathering, the train could sweep majestically behind her. But if an official was spotted, or if she was entering a more stringently policed public space, the train could be quickly unhooked and bundled away, or perhaps looped up and carried over her arm in a permissible fashion. The same principle applied to elaborate sleeves, collars, or other decorative elements. They could be designed to be easily added or removed, allowing for a quick change from potentially illegal to perfectly compliant in moments. It's like having a getaway car, but for your accessories. "These ostentatious jeweled cuffs, officer?" "Oh no, these are just sleeve warmers I was about to remove." Feeling a bit chilly, then suddenly not so chilly. The tailor or seamstress often played a crucial role in this delicate dance with the law, becoming a sort of co-conspirator or fashion lawyer for their clients. A skilled and knowledgeable tailor would be up to date on the latest sumptuary edicts. They could advise their patrons on what was permissible, what was risky, and how to achieve a look of fashionable elegance without technically breaking the rules. They might suggest using a slightly different and legal shade of blue, or a type of fur that mimicked a band one but wasn't on the official list. They were the artists who could translate a desire for luxury into a wearable reality that, with luck, wouldn't attract a fine. You can picture a hushed consultation. Signora, the regulations now forbid more than 3 pearl buttons on a sleeve of this fabric for your station. However, if we use these exquisite mother-of-pearl buttons, which are technically not pearls, and perhaps a very subtle gold thread around the buttonhole. Of course, some people just tried playing the system through feigned ignorance or strategic pleading. Oh, this hat feather? I had no idea it was from a male peacock of the northern long-tailed variety, which is, as you now inform me, restricted. I thought it was merely a very large, unusually iridescent chicken feather. My humblest apologies, officer, it certainly won't happen again. Until next time I find another impressively large chicken. If caught, one might plead poverty to reduce the fine, or argue that the garment was a gift from a great-aunt who lived in a different city with different rules, conveniently forgetting to mention that said great-aunt had been dead for 10 years. And while most sought to bend the rules rather than break them outright, there was always a degree of bold defiance, especially among the very wealthy and powerful, or the particularly rebellious. Some individuals might simply choose to wear what they pleased, viewing any subsequent fines as a kind Gilded Age extravagance tax, a cost of doing business or maintaining their flamboyant image. The scion of a powerful banking family might well afford to pay a few fines for wearing an illegally ostentatious doublet. The statement it made about his wealth and disregard for petty rules might have been worth the price. This, of course, further highlights the inconsistencies in enforcement. What a minor artisan couldn't dream of getting away with, a young lord might flaunt with impunity, or at least with only minor financial inconvenience. So you see, the world of Renaissance fashion under sumptuary law wasn't just about rules and restrictions. It was also a lively theater of creativity, subtle resistance, and ingenious workarounds. It was a constant, quiet negotiation between the desire for personal expression and the demands of the state, a sartorial cat-and-mouse game played out in silks and velvets, with every citizen a potential player, armed with their wits, their tailor, and perhaps a few detachable sleeves. We've had a good chuckle, perhaps, at the ingenious ways Renaissance citizens navigated the labyrinthine sumptuary laws, the hidden silk linings, the detachable sleeves, the artful excuses whispered to stern-faced officials. It's a testament to the human spirit's desire for self-expression. But as you drift deeper into this softly lit past, let's turn our thoughts to a group whose lives were perhaps even more directly and dramatically impacted by these elegance edicts. The artisans. What about the skilled hands that wove the brocades, dyed the velvets, stitched the gowns, and fashioned the jewels? How did this age of prescribed austerity and regulated finery affect the craftspeople who relied on the creation and sale of luxury goods for their daily bread and artistic fulfillment? Imagine you are one of these artisans. You are a master weaver in Florence, your hands calloused but nimble from years spent at the loom. Your workshop, perhaps a small, slightly dimmed space, hums with the rhythmic clatter of your craft. The air smells of wool, silk, and the faint earthy scent of natural dyes. You take immense pride in your ability to create intricate patterns, to blend colors in ways that make fabric sing. Perhaps your specialty is a particularly opulent cloth of gold, or a velvet so deep and rich it seems to swallow the light. This is your art, your livelihood, your contribution to the vibrant tapestry of your city. And then, a new sumptuary law is proclaimed from the steps of the Palazzo Vecchio. Your most elaborate designs, the ones that fetch the highest prices and bring you the most renown, are suddenly declared illegal for most of your clientele. The demand for that shimmering cloth of gold, which took you weeks to weave, plummets overnight. The vibrant crimson dye you perfected, derived from costly imported Kermes insects, is now restricted to only the highest nobility, a tiny fraction of your market. You can almost hear the disappointed snip of your shears as you cut a simpler, more morally upright pattern. The unsold bolts of magnificent fabric gathering dust in the corner, a silent testament to your curtailed creativity. This was the stark reality for many craftspeople. It's a mainstream historical fact that Renaissance artisans were often highly specialized. A weaver might focus on a particular type of silk, a dyer on specific complex colors, a goldsmith on intricate filigree work that was suddenly deemed excessive. This specialization, while a mark of their skill and a way to command higher prices in a booming luxury market, also made them particularly vulnerable when sumptuary laws shifted demand. If your entire business was built on producing, say, elaborate belts with large, jeweled buckles, and a new law suddenly decreed that buckles must be small, plain, and unadorned for anyone below the rank of a knight, your income could evaporate faster than morning mist on the Arno. The negative impacts were manifold. Beyond the obvious reduction in demand for overtly luxurious and therefore often more profitable items, there was the frustration of having one's artistic skills stifled. Imagine an embroiderer, capable of stitching breathtaking scenes with silk and gold thread, now limited to producing only simple monograms or modest floral borders. It's like telling a concert pianist they can only play scales. There was also the inherent risk involved if they chose to cater to the clandestine demand for illicit finery. If a tailor was caught creating a gown with a train 2 feet longer than legally permitted, or using forbidden imported velvet, they could face fines, confiscation of their materials, or even damage to their professional reputation. Their workshop might be searched, their precious bolts of fabric unceremoniously inspected. The anxiety of a sudden knock on the door from a sumptuary official would have been a constant companion for those who dared to bend the rules for their clients. You can almost see the nervous glance over the shoulder, the quick concealment of a particularly opulent piece of lace when an unfamiliar shadow falls across the doorway. However, human creativity is resourceful, and the world of Renaissance artisans was nothing if not adaptable. While some undoubtedly suffered, others found ways to navigate this new landscape, leading to some less obvious, perhaps even unintentionally positive or adaptive impacts. The restriction on overt material-based luxury may have, in some cases, stimulated a different kind of creativity. If you couldn't rely on sheer costliness of materials to impress, then skill in cut, perfection of tailoring, and subtlety of design became even more paramount. An exceptionally well-made garment of high quality but permitted wool, fitting its wearer like a second skin, could still speak volumes about status and taste, perhaps even more so than a clumsily made gown of expensive but ill-used brocade. This shift could have favored artisans who excelled in craftsmanship and understated elegance. As we saw with the stylish subterfuge of wearers, artisans, too, became experts in the gray areas. They might specialize in creating those luxurious linings, the hidden details that gave private pleasure, or in crafting items for those occasions. Weddings, festivals, diplomatic receptions, where the rules were temporarily relaxed. "Ah, signor," the tailor might whisper conspiratorially to a wealthy patron, "for your daughter's wedding, we can indeed use the Venetian silk with the silver thread. But for your everyday appearances before the council, perhaps this exquisite Florentine wool, dyed a most discreet and entirely legal shade of mulberry." Economists and historians continue to debate the net effect of sumptuary laws on local economies. Were they a significant drag on artisanal prosperity and innovation, or did they merely redirect creative and commercial energies into different, perhaps more subtle, forms of luxury and craftsmanship? It's likely the impact varied significantly depending on the specific craft, the city, the strictness of enforcement, and the artisan's ability to adapt. Some might have seen their businesses shrink, while others, particularly those producing high-quality goods from locally sourced, approved materials, might have even found a niche. It's the age-old story of economic disruption forcing innovation and adaptation, albeit under rather unusual, fashion-policing circumstances. You might joke that the guild of extremely understated button makers suddenly saw a boom in business, their tiny, perfectly crafted horn buttons becoming the new symbol of discreet good taste. The guilds, those powerful associations of craftspeople, undoubtedly played a complex role. On one hand, they were there to protect the interests of their members. It's a quirky but well-documented tidbit that there are records of petitions from artisan guilds to civic authorities. These documents might complain about the harshness of certain sumptuary laws, pointing out their detrimental impact on trade and the livelihoods of skilled workers. They might ask for clarification on vaguely worded rules that made it impossible for their members to know what was legal to produce. "Your Magnificences," a petition from the Silk Weavers Guild might humbly state, "the recent edict regarding the allowable sheen on Sabbath-day fabrics is causing considerable confusion and distress amongst our most devout and law-abiding weavers. Could a standard for acceptable luster be demonstrated, perhaps using a moderately shiny pigeon? Conversely, Guilds were also concerned with maintaining standards of quality and the reputation of their city's crafts. They might cooperate with sumptuary legislation if it was seen to curb shoddy workmanship or the use of inferior materials in deceptive ways. They might even institute their own internal rules that echoed sumptuary principles, ensuring that even simpler goods produced by their members were of impeccable quality. Ultimately, behind the economic statistics and the legal texts, there was a human cost and a story of resilience. Imagine the dyer, his hands permanently stained with indigo and madder, watching the demand for his most complex and beautiful shades dwindle. He has a family to feed, apprentices to train. Does he try to invent new, permissible colors? Does he focus on achieving the most perfect, unvarying black, a color often associated with dignity and sobriety, and therefore less likely to be banned? Or does he sigh, hang up his apron, and look for work as a guard on the city walls, where at least the uniform regulations are clear? A once proud peacock feather merchant might find himself desperately trying to rebrand as a purveyor of premium chicken quills for the discerning scribe, his sales pitch lacking its former flamboyant confidence. It's a gentle reminder that these laws, while sometimes seemingly frivolous in their focus on fashion details, had very real consequences for the men and women whose artistry and labor clothed Renaissance society. Their world was one of skill, beauty, and the constant, quiet hum of creation, a hum that sometimes had to change its tune to match the ever-shifting song of the law. We've lingered in the workshops of Renaissance artisans, feeling the weight of sumptuary laws on their skilled hands and creative spirits. The snip of shears often dictated more by legal statute than by artistic vision. Now, as you continue to drift on this quiet current of history, let's untangle another crucial thread in this complex tapestry of clothing control. These elegance edicts were by no means a one-size-fits-all affair. The rules you had to follow, the fabrics you could drape around yourself, the very colors that were permissible for your person, depended enormously on who you were, specifically your gender and your precise rung on the often rigidly defined social ladder. It was a system of gendered garment governance and sartorial stratification. Let's first consider how these laws differentiated between men and women. More often than not, you'd find that the regulations were particularly detailed, and frequently stricter, when it came to women's attire. If you were a woman in Renaissance Italy, your wardrobe was a matter of intense public and legal interest. The methods of regulation and control have also transformed. We no longer, for the most part in Western democratic societies, have laws dictating the specific colors or materials individuals can wear based on their social class. The idea of being fined for wearing too many buttons seems absurd. Yet, control and regulation of attire haven't disappeared entirely. They've just taken different forms. Think of workplace dress codes, which can be incredibly specific about what constitutes professional attire. School uniforms are, in essence, a modern form of sumptuary law, designed to promote equality, reduce distractions, and instill a sense of order, goals remarkably similar to those of Renaissance legislators. There are safety standards for children's clothing, regulations about flammability, and intellectual property laws protecting designer logos and unique design elements from counterfeiting. And here's a quirky tidbit that brings sumptuary ideas into the digital age. In many online games and virtual worlds, avatars' appearances, their skins or digital clothing, are often restricted or tiered. You might need to achieve a certain status within the game, or make a real money purchase, to unlock more elaborate or desirable virtual garments for your online persona. A kind of digital sumptuary system. Finally, consider the aspirational consumer. In the Renaissance, it was the wealthy merchant trying to emulate the style of the nobility, pushing the boundaries of the sumptuary laws. Today you see echoes of this in the desire to own entry-level luxury items, a keychain, a perfume, a small leather good from a famous designer, as a way to participate, even in a small way, in that world of high fashion. The vast market for counterfeit luxury goods speaks to this same aspiration, the desire to project an image of wealth and status that might not align with reality. Influencer culture on social media often fuels this, showcasing highly curated lifestyles and aspirational wardrobes that many seek to emulate. Back then it might have been, is your purple too purple? Now perhaps it's, are your sneakers the latest limited edition drop? And are your jeans distressed in that artfully expensive way, but not too distressed for your aunt's conservative garden party? The anxieties and aspirations persist, just with different details and price tags. So, while the specific legal framework is gone, the human drama played out through clothing continues. It's a mainstream historical fact that the global fashion industry is a multi-trillion-dollar enterprise, a clear indication of the enduring economic, social, and psychological importance we place on what we wear. We may have traded sumptuary officials for fashion magazines and social media feeds, and legal statutes for the unwritten, but powerful codes of trend and taste. Imagine Savonarola's reaction to a modern influencer's luxury unboxing video. The bonfire would probably need its own dedicated power grid. Yet, the fundamental way we use clothing to navigate our social worlds, to express identity, to signal status, and to judge others, bears more than a passing resemblance to the concerns that preoccupied those Renaissance Italians. The stage has changed, the costumes are different, but the human play of appearance and aspiration, it seems, goes on. So, as we begin to draw the soft, velvet curtain on our excursion into modern parallels, and the echoes of Renaissance anxieties in our own consumption patterns gently fade, what final lingering thoughts can we gather from those centuries of Italian authorities meticulously measuring sleeves and agonizing over the precise shade of permissible purple? What do these lavish limits, these earnest attempts to legislate elegance, truly tell us about the beating heart of Renaissance society, and perhaps, just perhaps, about some of the enduring threads in our own human fabric? One of the most profound lessons you might find as you drift in these quiet reflections is how deeply these sumptuary laws were rooted in an anxiety about change. The Renaissance, as we often picture it, was a period of extraordinary artistic flourishing, intellectual rebirth, and burgeoning trade, a dynamic, vibrant era. And it was. But it's also a mainstream historical fact that Renaissance society, for all its innovation, remained deeply conservative in many of its social structures, valuing hierarchy, tradition, and order. The Black Death in the mid-14th century had torn through Europe, leading to profound social and economic shifts, including labor shortages that sometimes empowered lower classes and an increase in disposable income for some survivors, which could fuel a desire for finer things. The rise of a wealthy, powerful merchant class, whose fortunes were built on commerce rather than inherited land, began to challenge the old feudal and aristocratic orders. Fashion, in its dazzling and increasingly varied forms, became one of the most visible arenas where these tensions played out. Those peacock feathers and purple silks weren't just pretty adornments. They were potent symbols of this shifting landscape, and the laws attempting to control them were, in many ways, an attempt to hold back the tide, or at least to channel it in ways that preserve the familiar social architecture. This speaks to another crucial understanding: the immense power of visual symbols, especially clothing. In an era where literacy was not universal, appearance was an immediate and universally understood language. Your attire communicated your identity, your status, your profession, your allegiance, and even your moral standing, or so it was believed. Societies invest deep, often unconscious, meaning in these visual cues. When those cues became confused, when a banker's wife could, by her dress, be mistaken for a duchess, it wasn't just a fashion faux pas. It was seen as a tear in the very fabric of social understanding. The sumptuary laws were an attempt to keep this visual language clear, to ensure that everyone could read society correctly. And it's a quirky, yet significant, tidbit to recall that the very concept of fashion, as we know it, styles that change with relative speed, driven by novelty and emulation, was itself a relatively new and sometimes unsettling phenomenon in the late medieval and early Renaissance periods. Before then, clothing styles tended to evolve much more slowly. This new dynamism, this quickening pulse of sartorial change, was another force that authorities felt compelled to try and manage, contributing to their desire to lay down rules. Underpinning much of this was a profound desire for order and control. The Renaissance world, for all its beauty, could also feel deeply chaotic. Europe was frequently racked by wars, political instability, and the ever-present threat of plague. Religious certainties were challenged, culminating in the Reformation towards the latter part of the period we're considering. In such a turbulent environment, exerting control over something as tangible and visible as dress might have offered a semblance of stability, a way to impose order on at least one sphere of life. If you couldn't control the shifting allegiances of princes or the spread of heresy, perhaps you could at least ensure that people's buttons were of a regulation size and their sleeves weren't excessively puffed. It was, in a way, an attempt to create a well-regulated, harmonious outward appearance for society, hoping it might reflect or even foster an inner moral and civic order. These laws also serve to define community and belonging. By meticulously legislating difference, this for the noble, that for the merchant, another for the artisan, sumptuary codes reinforced not just hierarchy but also group identity. You belonged to a certain stratum, a particular guild, a specific city, and your dress was part of that belonging. It visually demarcated us from them. Whether them meant a lower social class, a rival city-state, or even those deemed morally lax. The regulations helped to weave a web of shared expectations and visible distinctions that bound communities together, even as it separated them internally. Yet, the history of sumptuary laws also teaches us about the limits of law itself. The constant need to revise, amend, and reissue these statutes, the endless struggle with enforcement that we've touched upon, the ingenuity of citizens in finding loopholes. All these testify to the fact that law has its limitations when it comes up against powerful human desires, deep-seated economic forces, and the ever-flowing currents of cultural change. You can legislate against a particular feather, but it seems you can't easily legislate against the human desire to adorn oneself, to express individuality, or to aspire to a little more shimmer in one's life. Historians continue to ponder whether sumptuary laws were ultimately a futile attempt to halt inevitable social change, a kind of legislative canute trying to hold back the waves, or if they did, in fact, succeed in slowing, shaping, or channeling societal transformations for a significant period. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. And ultimately, perhaps what these lavish limits reveal most clearly is something enduring about human nature. That perennial tension between individual expression and societal constraint, between the desire to stand out and the pressure to fit in. The Renaissance Florentine agonizing over whether his new doublet was too ostentatious, or the Venetian lady wondering if her chopins were a hair too high, isn't so very far removed in spirit from modern anxieties about brand names, trend cycles, or simply what to wear to make the right impression. The eternal question, you could say, was then as now, to peacock or not to peacock. Renaissance Italy just tried to provide a very detailed, legally binding, and often rather contradictory answer. If only they'd known about the comfortable anonymity of sweatpants and hoodies, the sumptuary committees might have collectively sighed, declared a moral victory by default, and taken very early retirement. As we leave these Renaissance citizens to their sartorial struggles, it's clear that while the specific laws concerning forbidden finery like peacock feathers and purple shoes have long since been relegated to the archives, the deeper conversations they represent, about value, identity, community, and the power of appearance, continue to unfold in every society, in every age. Perhaps the ultimate lesson is that while you can write a statute against a particular style, you can't easily extinguish the human spirit's desire to express itself, to dream in color, and occasionally to ruffle a few carefully regulated feathers. Now, as the echoes of those Renaissance streets begin to soften, and the concerns of city councils and church fathers gently recede, allow yourself to drift. Let the weight of history settle lightly, like a soft velvet cloak, comforting and familiar. The vibrant hues of Italian life, the deep crimson of a patron's robe, the earthy sienna of Tuscan hills, the azure of a Venetian sky, begin to blend and soften, like watercolors touched by a gentle mist. The sharp clip-clop of horses on cobblestones, the distant call of a merchant in the piazza, the solemn chant from a cathedral choir, all these sounds now merge into a soothing, distant hum, a lullaby from centuries past. You can almost feel the cool, smooth surface of ancient stone beneath your fingertips, the worn parchment of old edicts, the faint, lingering scent of beeswax and old incense. The anxieties about social order, the meticulous counting of florins, the earnest debates about morality and modesty, all these have played their part. They were the concerns of people much like us, living their lives, making their choices, trying to find beauty and meaning in their world, just as we do in ours. Their solutions were different, their canvas broader in some ways, more constrained in others, but the human heart, with its desires and its worries, remains a familiar landscape. There is a quiet dignity in their attempts to create order, even if those attempts sometimes seem peculiar or overly strict to our modern sensibilities. There is a beauty in the craftsmanship they sought to both encourage and control, in the rich fabrics and vibrant colors that filled their world, even when those colors were subject to the most searching scrutiny. And there is a gentle humor in the eternal cat-and-mouse game between those who made the rules and those who sought, with equal ingenuity, to bend them, to find their own small spaces for personal expression. Let the details now blur. The precise cut of a sleeve, the exact number of pearls, the specific shade of forbidden purple. These distinctions no longer need to trouble you. They are dissolving into the soft tapestry of the past, becoming part of a larger, more tranquil pattern. What remains is a sense of connection, a gentle understanding of a time when the world dressed itself with such care, such intention, such a profound belief in the power of appearance to shape reality. The concerns were weighty, the rules complex, but for now that weight can be lifted. The story has been told. The need for vigilance, for judgment, for adherence to the letter of the law, can be laid aside. You are drifting now in a calm and peaceful space, beyond the reach of Renaissance fashion police, beyond the call of the town crier, beyond the earnest pronouncements from the pulpit. There is only the soft murmur of history, the gentle rhythm of time passing, carrying you softly, effortlessly, towards a quiet and restorative sleep. The vibrant stage of Renaissance Italy fades into a serene and comforting darkness, and all is well.